Okay, welcome back everybody to day 2 of our Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center Symposium. Whether you're attending the session, whether you attended the session yesterday to hear the talks from scientists and resource managers from across the region, or whether you're joining us for the first time today, we're glad you're here and welcome. We have a great program today that is beginning shortly with our keynote address from Dr. Kelsey Leonard. And we hope that you'll stay after to join our plenary panel speaking to issues of climate adaptation justice at 10:45. This will be followed in the afternoon by 3 climate adaptation workshops that you can choose from, and a closing session where we'll break into groups for deeper discussion and input. For the full schedule, see the NECASC website, or you can look for a link in the chat. And then we also, just a reminder to fill out the survey to provide feedback on our working science themes, which is also provided in a link. At this point, I was going to hand the reins over to Alice Besterman, who is a NECASC fellow, to introduce our keynote speaker. She is unfortunately without power on Cape Cod due to the nor'easter that passed through last night. And so instead, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Kelsey Leonard. She is a water scientist, a legal scholar and policy expert, and an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation in New York, and currently an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on Indigenous water justice embedded in the context of climate, land sovereignty, policy, and governance. In her work, Dr. Leonard integrates Indigenous perspectives into climate adaptation planning and seeks to establish Indigenous traditions of water conservation as the foundation for international water policymaking. Towards this end, she has proposed and recently published on the Wampum Framework for Adaptation Planning in Response to Sea Level Rise, which is informed by Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic coastal tribal nation science and knowledge systems. Dr. Leonard earned her Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology and Anthropology with honors from Harvard University, a Master's of Science in Water Science Policy and Management from the University of Oxford, a law degree from Duquesne University, and a PhD in Political Science from McMaster's University. She has been recognized as a 30 under 30 world environmental leader by the North American Association of Environmental Education, and a Native American 40 under 40 award recipient by the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development. Her doctoral dissertation examines Indigenous water governance in the Great Lakes. For her research, she was also awarded one of the most prestigious postdoctoral awards in Canada, the Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship. Dr. Leonard represents the Shinnecock Indian Nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on Oceans, which is in charge with protecting America's ocean ecosystem and coastline. She also served as a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. Her regional ocean policy work in collaboration with tribes, state, federal, and fishery management councils entities received a Peter Benchley Ocean Award for Excellence in Solutions. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Leonard with us here today, speaking about how Indigenous traditions of water conservation and partnership, including interdisciplinary and cross-cultural partnerships, are the pillar of climate adaptation. Dr. Leonard's talk will be followed by a question and answer period using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelsey Leonard.
Thank you so much, John. It's so great to be with you all today. I can see that we've got a really wonderful turnout, especially for an early morning session. So let me just get my slides going and we will start the conversation. Okay, so Akwe, hello everyone. Today I want to talk with you about a new vision for how we connect and relate to water, including our rising seas. If at all today you want to connect over Twitter, you're welcome to live tweet today's session, and you can @ me at Kelsey T. Leonard in your mentions, or you are also welcome to connect with me in that space after today if you have follow-up questions. So I want to provide a bit of introductions to who I am and where I come from for our conversation today. Then I want to take us to a conversation around ocean justice and what it means in the context of climate adaptation, our existing climate crisis, and hopefully a transition to climate action. And as with everything, there is likely not enough time to fully uncover a lot of the inequity and injustice facing Indigenous peoples in New England, in the Northeast, in 60 minutes. So we're going to focus in today. We're going to look at some of the impacts in the context of sea level rise, one of the climate stressors that we know is already present and will continue to be exacerbated in coming years due to our current climate crisis. But it's not all doom and gloom. I do think that there are ways in which we can look at sea level rise, look at adaptation, and hopefully chart a path forward. And so that's what our conversation today will be about. And then we'll end and round out with a Q&A. So I opened today in using my language, saying hello, wishing you all hopefully a good day, Wanikasak. I am from the Shinnecock Nation. I'm an enrolled citizen. This is a map of our territory. If you're not totally familiar, I'm sure we probably have a bit of an international audience with a regional concentration in the Northeast. Having grown up there, it is, shockingly, unsurprisingly shocking how many people don't understand the geography of the Northeast, of New England, and all of our tribal nations that exist within these original homelands. And so I share this with you. This is the east end of Long Island, traditionally our ancestral territory as Shinnecock people. Due to colonialism and illegal land stealings and usurpations, we now exist within the sort of purple shaded areas of our current Shinnecock territory, still our ancestral homeland. So that's something that we're really proud of, is being able to, after 400 years of colonization, still exists in our homelands on our ancestral territory. Although ideally we would have more access to our traditional lands throughout the east end of Long Island. But today's conversation is also not just about land, but about water and the intersection and interface of both. So as you can see here, we're a coastal Algonquin Indigenous nation, tribal nation. We literally exist right now, our existing territory, on a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water, and then a barrier island to the Atlantic Ocean. So historically, we have always been and continue to be shore protectors. Shinnecock in our language means people of the shore. We harvest quahog and whelk shells to carve out wampum, as you can see here in my imagery, our bay people and fisher people, and have a long storied history of connection to our whale relatives and whaling in its entirety throughout the Northeast and around the world. So I share that with you to acknowledge where I come from and also where our vision for the future is as Indigenous peoples of the Northeast, that we have millennia of traditional ecological knowledge that we have built through long-term observation and generational transmission that allow for us to think of creative ways to use Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science for adaptation and mitigation efforts in the context of climate change. And so that also leads us into a question around justice. I talked to you a little bit about land encroachment and the impacts of colonization on my nation, but also more broadly for tribal nations throughout the Northeast. But this question of justice, sometimes it gets confined to territorial, terrestrial boundaries. It almost feels like the questions of law and justice can't exist in marine environments, in the watery scapes that many of us have as a part of our identities and our daily existence. And so a lot of my work is challenging that, is challenging our conceptions of justice to be applied in the context of these watery environments, whether that be salt or fresh or brackish or a mix thereof. We need to think of justice in its totality. We cannot, and I love Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and her framing of this. We cannot have climate justice without ocean justice. We cannot have environmental justice without ocean justice. For so long, it's been difficult even to have environmental justice recognized as a burgeoning principle for environmental policy and lawmaking. But even within that space, as I mentioned earlier, it seems to be burdened by a boundary of terrestrial nature. And we need to break down those boundaries, break down those obstacles, and really think of justice in the context of the ocean. And Dr. Johnson really lays this out for us in much of her career and in her work. And she has this quote as the founder of the Urban Ocean Lab. She says, ocean justice is where ocean conservation and social justice intersect. If we think about where water is the most polluted, who gets impacted by storms, who is most dependent on the ocean and suffers when there's overfishing, it often is poor communities and communities of color along the coastline. When we think about ocean conservation, it can't just be for the spots in front of fancy resorts or the homes of wealthy individuals. We should also be thinking about not just who bears the brunt of the impacts on the ocean, but who gets the benefit when we do take care of it. And for someone who is from an Indigenous nation and community that is bordered by the Hamptons, you know, the quote unquote playground of the rich and famous, at least for close to a century, this resonates innately within my core, that we can see that there is a disproportionate burden placed on communities of color, placed on Indigenous communities, placed on communities who are economically disenfranchised to bear ocean injustice, to bear climate injustice, while the homes of the rich and the wealthy and their summer playgrounds are protected. They get adaptation, they get mitigation, and others do not. And oftentimes it comes down to questions of resource and financial capacity, but we have to do better. You know, when we think about this current administration, when we think about the prospects for COP26, which will be happening shortly, we are supposed to be, quote unquote, building back better. We're supposed to be leaving no one behind. But to do so, we have to reconcile and confront the systemic injustices that have been present within our national and global communities for decades, if not centuries. And I think Dr. Johnson does a great job of putting us on that path. But I also think there's an aspect of today's conversation that will take a more narrow focus and really try and understand how do Indigenous nations potentially approach this concept of ocean justice. And I sort of frame this in the context of what I call Indigenous ocean justice. If ocean justice is concerned with the recognitional, procedural, and distributional advancement of justice for the ocean, then from an Indigenous perspective, we also add a principle of restorative advancement for justice for the ocean and for the ocean's well-being. And therefore, in this context, we recognize that tribal nations are recognized as rights holders with sovereignty in marine environments, not just bounded to these terrestrial imagined borders. That we recognize that tribal nations are leaders in decision-making and co-management of shared ocean resources. That we recognize that they should be equitable beneficiaries of ocean benefits and not bearers of disproportionate burden due to ocean uses, and that they can be empowered to fulfill responsibilities for ocean kinship and stewardship so the ocean may exist, thrive, and naturally evolve. And so as we narrow in and look at what might be some calls to action or ways in which Indigenous ocean justice can be and is already being implemented in New England and the Northeast, if I could put one call to action to all of you today is to think about Dr. Johnson's framework of ocean justice and to think about what I've put forward here in the context of Indigenous ocean justice and ask yourself, what have I done to promote ocean justice in my work? What have I done to enable Indigenous ocean justice in the Northeast and in my broader work? And I think that these principles, these 4 principles, give you a pathway to operationalize ocean justice in your work. So coming back to my home community, this is an aerial view courtesy of NASA of our Shinnecock territory, or portion of it that we call the Shinnecock Neck, the peninsula and the barrier island then to the Atlantic Ocean. And so this is an aerial image taken last fall, so 2020. And you can see here, again, we are bordered on 3 sides by water. One of the concerns I wanted to share with you today about climate change, about ocean justice, is around sea level rise. So this is our home community today. And under the projections of the NOAA sea level rise simulator, here is the potential threat our existing territory could face due to sea level rise. So we know that in the best case scenario, we are going to and already do see impacts of sea level rise on our territory. But we are likely to see these red areas inundated by 2030. Now we can see then by 2050 and by 2100 that we might get into, depending on how we act as a global community, we might see increasing losses and inundation of land to the yellow portions of the map listed here. Now, we are not isolated at this. If you go beyond the imagined borders of political boundaries, this is all of Long Island is going to be facing sea level rise issues. This is all of the Northeast in different capacities and with different sort of levels of impact. But what is unique for tribal nations is that we are still being impacted by colonialism, by oppression of what is currently known as the United States, in that this is the existing land that we have. There is not an opportunity to acquire new land without a very oppositional force of settler Americans saying, you natives don't deserve to have new land. We've already seen that being neighbors for over 100 years to the wealthy Hamptonites, and we continue to see that. And right now, there's litigation for tribes throughout the Northeast and throughout the United States that makes it very difficult due to a Supreme Court case to be able to take new land into trust. So when we think about sea level rise, when we think about the impact of climate change on communities and the potential for the need to relocate, and not only relocate, but relocate with dignity, there are legal, legislative, and policy challenges that make it very difficult and unjust and inequitable for Indigenous peoples and tribal peoples in the United States compared to others. And so it gets to be a very complex and wicked problem. But I'm hopeful that we can find a path forward. So as former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations has said, if we really are going to tackle climate change, we have to understand that climate change does not respect borders. It does not respect who you are, rich and poor, small and big. Therefore, this is what we call global challenges, which require global solidarity. And I think that's why you're all here today, listening in to this session, listening in over the past few days to the symposium, because you really are hopeful that we can create innovative partnerships that allow for us to create that solidarity to address these challenges and hopefully have a shared pathway forward. Maybe some of us may find this next statement to be a bit naive, but I do believe in the goodness of humanity. I think even Anne Frank has said that and said that in her lifetime. And we can do better. We can aspire to have goodwill towards each other in the face of the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, but hopeful that we can get there. So let's talk about some of the science. Throughout the Northeast, we could see sea levels rise in the region by as much as 7 feet by 2100. This was a study done by COP in 2020. These projections are changing constantly. The new IPCC report came out, but what we generally know is that sea level rise is already present in our region. It's already causing stressors for communities, as I'll note later, and it is likely to be exacerbated due to climate change in coming years. So it's not something that's going away. So we do have to think about both mitigation and adaptation, and what does our climate action look like for ocean justice throughout the region. Now, what we also recognize is that sea level rise is something that has been occurring historically throughout our region. Even as Indigenous peoples, we have lived millennia in this part of the world and adapted to sea level rise. What's different is the frequency of the rise of that sea level is increasing at an exponential rate than it ever has before. And so that is what's challenging, right? Time is challenging. We don't have the luxury of time or the ability of time to enable more long-term behavior change. We have to act now. And so that becomes, a significant challenge as we move forward. But it also becomes an opportunity as we think about how do you adapt to sea level rise. There's a millennia of Indigenous knowledge about adaptation to sea level rise that we can and should be leaning into, particularly for Northeast and New England, where you may only have about 400 years of knowledge of what this region has looked like, felt like, what you've experienced in terms of the natural world and the seascape. But now, with Indigenous peoples, there's a whole untapped area as well of additional knowledge. And if our knowledges came together, think about the types of innovation and advancements we could make. And so that's the hope of the work that I do. Again, with some higher level projections and timelines, we're thinking that through 2050, we're likely to see about 2 feet of rise along the Atlantic coast, regardless of emissions. This is from a COP study in 2020, not Convention of the Parties, but KOPP. And so what we're seeing there as well is, again, sea level rise is present in our communities and is likely to be still a stressor within our communities through 2050, even under the best case scenario. 2 feet of rise is still a significant amount for us to need to adapt and also provide additional mitigation efforts towards. Now, beyond 2050, under a moderate emissions projection, which means that we do some good work and we tackle this, we are likely to still see 1.4 feet by 2050 and 3.3 feet by 2100. Now, if we have a high end rise, which means we're not doing well, this next COP26 conference doesn't go the way that we would hope it would, our climate action is not immediate, we are likely going to be at that high end of 2.6 feet by 2050 and 6.9 feet by 2100. But there is always the potential that it could be worse than that, depending on what we choose as humans to enable in terms of restorative justice. So what are the potential impacts of this rise for tribal nations? Well, again, I just wanted to orient you as well to the tribal nations that are in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. We kind of have a weird understanding of geography. We say Northeast, we say New England, we say Southern New England. I share this with you, maybe we'll just call it as, this is a map adapted from United South and Eastern Tribes, incorporated an intertribal organization that works for the advancement of tribal sovereignty in the region. Might just call it the Eastern region or the Atlantic seascape. But these are the federally recognized tribes in the region. There are additional state recognized tribes in the region, not listed on the map. And then we also have really, really large urban Indigenous populations in cities from Boston to New York, which has over 100,000 urban Indigenous peoples, to Baltimore, to Washington, DC. Again, these urban scapes are also Indigenous landscapes. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about our adaptation efforts and our climate action as a regional community, that we are inclusive of Indigenous peoples. One, because this is our homelands. We have embedded Indigenous knowledge for millennia in this part of the world that should be utilized in how we plan for the future, but also because we are often disproportionately impacted by the burdens of ocean and seascape injustice. So sea level rise impacts that we're seeing right now across tribal nations in the Northeast. So we're seeing increased flooding. We also have seen permanent inundation of tribal coastal areas and have the potential for continued inundation. We're seeing wetland loss and migration, saltwater intrusion into drinking water supplies, additional forms of drinking water contamination, cultural resource impacts, as well as displacement, as I mentioned earlier. Loss of lands, despite growing populations, means that we are now and in the future being physically displaced by climate change. But today, again, we only have a short amount of time together, so I want to focus on drinking water contamination. So tribal nations, we face distinct challenges to water security given increasing SLR threats. Some of these water security threats that we are concerned with include infrastructure. So again, we talk about injustices, we talk about the historical legacy of colonialism that is ongoing. We have infrastructure issues on many of the tribal territories throughout the Northeast, whether that is not having adequate infrastructure that is comparable to our settler neighbors, or having old infrastructure relying largely on groundwater wells, not having access to a public water system or a tribally operated water system, makes it so that there is a lot more room for water contamination and water stress for community members. Additionally, we're seeing impacts of flooding and storm surge that can lead to saltwater intrusion, having a direct impact on contamination of drinking water. Also, if we are seeing within coastal areas increased pollution and degradation of the water quality of those marine environments, and then through flooding or storm surge, that water is inundates groundwater systems, we see additional contamination. That could be from additional effluents, nitrogen overloads, et cetera. That also can lead to increased contamination of the water supply. We also have population growth, which is wonderful. People are having babies, which is great. But with population growth and land loss through inundation, but also through potential other reasons, we're still facing encroachment and the attempt by settlers to steal off land, to build their fence lines a little closer, 100 years of that, and you lose, close to 100 acres of territory. And so as you see climate change being a stressor of land loss, sea level rise being a stressor of land loss, in addition to the human impact of land loss, but your population is growing, which is wonderful. Where do you house those people? How do you make sure that you have livable lands for those people to exist on and thrive on? And then also, how do you make sure that there's a land use balance, right? We can't just have a population sprawl for housing. We have to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that we are living with the landscape, and which is something that is very culturally innate for our peoples. And then there's also questions about wastewater. Even with the flooding and storm surge, we also have impacts on wastewater, not only on sort of aquifers, but when we think about wastewater within Long Island, within a lot of our tribal communities, we're reliant, and throughout the Northeast, we're reliant on cesspools and septic systems, and they're often old and dilapidated. They're not the new ones that do the nitrogen removal and all of that wonderful stuff. And so when we have these storm events and these surge events, those systems can get overwhelmed and can leak. And that has implications as well for water quality, both within the aquifer and local surrounding surface waters. So what do we do? Generally, in the context of sea level rise, in terms of adaptation, we look to adaptation frameworks to determine how we should move forward for our planning efforts as a society. How do we make good decisions to adapt to these rising seas? And so I started in my research to look at what were some of the existing adaptation frameworks that were out there in the world. And this is the generic framework put forward by the IPCC in their 2019 report. I'm hopeful that it might have changed. I haven't actually had a chance to take a look. But this is, sort of the generic approach, which is planned retreat, moving homes and other infrastructure away from water, accommodate, which is sort of raising infrastructure, putting in different types of hard engineering, soft engineering to allow for the ability to accommodate rising seas. The protect framework is usually around hard defenses as well as soft defenses, thinking about seawalls and trying to push the water away. And also the attack is and through the attack framework or principle is to reclaim land, so build out into the sea and be able to address sea level rise in that way. But when I was looking at this framework, I started to just feel a disconnect. It didn't feel very connected to Indigenous peoples, to Indigenous knowledge, or to enabling everyday citizen behavior change. It felt a bit clinical, a bit stale. And oftentimes when we think about science communication, we talk about being good storytellers. A part of being good storytellers is having great design, conveying images that inspire people. And I don't know about you, but that previous image didn't really inspire me. And so I kind of wondered, well, why is that happening? So I looked at what some other scholars in the space of adaptation science had been saying. And so Marino wrote in 2018 and suggested that the current concepts around adaptation frameworks actually represent adaptation oppression. They highlight or tend to highlight Western scientific and cultural biases reflected in the limited adaptation options present in the existing framework. So what she was saying is that the existing frameworks we have are not really created for all of the different types of communities out there, and yet they're being promoted as such. They're being promoted as a one-size-fits-all. And so Marino talks about this as adaptation oppression. And as Indigenous peoples, this resonated. I was like, oh, okay, so we are replicating, the oppression in other spaces in the adaptation space as well. And previously to Marino's piece, Hardy et al. Also underscored that they felt that they're in the processes for developing response strategies to climate change, that there is what they call a colorblind adaptation planning, which really is a process by which adaptation planning overlooks racial inequality. It doesn't take into consideration systemic racism in how we think about our environmental governance institutions and how that shapes the types of adaptation options that we put forward for communities. And so I said, okay, this really is presenting a problem. It's presenting a problem that right now, in the context of tribal nations, which I am concerned with for my research, the existing measures that protect, accommodate, retreat, avoid attack, they aren't resonating with tribal nations in our region. They provide militarized and combative language, generally not an approach that we take towards the natural world. They don't really show us any cultural connections to us as Indigenous peoples. As you can see here, even the design is very Western centric with sort of the house structure, the colors that are chosen. And additionally, the options provided are all human centric. Remember what we said earlier about Indigenous ocean justice. It also includes a restorative principle around the ocean's well-being as a living entity. And so these adaptation frameworks weren't considering our more than human relations, our fish beings, the ocean itself, water as a living entity. That wasn't a part of these frameworks. And so set with that challenge of these gaps, we put forward a new framework specific to Eastern coastal tribal nations. So there are limitations in this. I don't think it's a one size fits all. I really hope that that from this process, we see more context specific and localized adaptation frameworks being developed. But we put this forward. I think we might be able to share with you in the chat or have it shared through other avenues for the conference symposium. But we put forward a framework called the Wampum Adaptation Framework. The article is open access, so you can go and download it at any point in time. And here is what we said. So the Wampum Adaptation Framework, it stands for Witness, Acknowledge, Mend, Protect, Unite, and Move. We used wampum, again, as I mentioned earlier. It is a really innate cultural aspect of our philosophy as Eastern coastal tribal nations along the Atlantic seascape. And it also has foundations in our treaty making. And so when we understand how we relate not only to each other as human beings, but to the water itself, wampum is very much integral to the formation of those good relationships. And so that's why this is the framing that we use. And so let's go through some of the principles. We're also going to focus, I won't have time to do a deep dive on all of them, but I want to focus on the MEND principle today, but I'll share with you all of the principles and do encourage you to read the article for more if you're intrigued. So the first principle is witness, which is witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. Oftentimes we talk about nature-based solutions. I call those indigenous solutions, which really is leaning into the indigenous knowledge of observations over millennia and the knowledge of our more than human relations. Sometimes within the science community, that's called biomimicry. We can learn a lot by taking the opportunity to witness what is already happening. How is the natural world already adapting to these climate stressors? And maybe that can inform the types of options we put forward for our adaptations as human beings. The next principle is acknowledge. Acknowledge traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. So again, we have seen historically indigenous knowledge be violently oppressed and suppressed, but we also have seen it legally be prohibited throughout the United States, and particularly in the Northeast and New England. You know, I was at Harvard University for my undergraduate, and I came into Harvard in 2006. And there still was a law in 2006 that any native seen in the city of Boston could be shot on sight. That law has since been reversed and struck from the codes within the city of Boston, but due to the advocacy of indigenous peoples and leaders in tribal nations. But that was, I believe the law was struck in 2007, but there still was, you know, all of that time in which these laws existed, continue to exist. And so when we think about acknowledging and recognizing indigenous knowledge, it's not just saying, oh yeah, that sounds nice. It's actually putting ourselves into action to undo, to reconcile with the past, to undo it, and then to promote more opportunities for justice for all peoples in the region. And that can start with really valuing these teachings and these cultural knowledges. The next principle is mend, which is mend the shoreline and practice healing for coastal and environmental sovereignty. We're going to focus mostly on this one today, but again, there's so much we can learn from our relatives in how they mend the shoreline, take care of the shore, take care of the water and the seascape, that we can help to bolster that restoration as humans. So in focusing on this, I highlight in the paper the work that we did at the Shinnecock Nation, prioritizing our indigenous knowledge, being people of the shore. We created a living shoreline to address some of the shoreline erosion issues that we had post Hurricane Sandy. And then, you know, utilizing sort of these nature-based solutions, indigenous solutions, we also highlighted that we wanted to promote healing in our coastal territory. And in doing so, there was a lot of community activity in the restoration of this shoreline. We planted eelgrass, we put in a lot of barrier stones to reduce wave energy, as you can see here, because we're not only people of the shore, but we're actually people of the stony shore. So embedded within our Indigenous language was knowledge of how to enable shoreline protection. And so we used that to build out this living shoreline and had community members actively involved throughout the process in the beach replenishment and in eelgrass plantings and in oyster seedings. And then I think you heard yesterday, I am so sorry that I missed this, but I think you heard yesterday from Dr. Spivey from the Pamunkey Indian tribe and the wonderful work that they have also done in terms of living shorelines, also being a tribal nation based on a peninsula. And so there is, and you can see this here, they're located in the Delmarva Peninsula, close to Chesapeake Bay, so also facing increasing threats due to sea level rise. But instead of doing an approach of attacking, our conception is, how do we mend the shoreline? How do we ensure that that shoreline is healthy? And then we as humans will be healthy. And so I think that that's a really unique approach captured in the wampum framework and also captured in the existing practices of Indigenous peoples in the region. The next principle is protect, which is protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors. And this is recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, that we have been existing with sea level rise for millennia. We have stories and understandings of submerged cultural resources that are now submerged because we used to have fishing villages and community sites that were previously not underwater, but now are through out towards the outer continental shelf. And so as we think about how, as the modern world thinks about how to use the ocean, we have always known the ocean as a relative, as a place of connection. And so, as we think about these modern uses of the ocean, we have to be conscientious that there are, many, many cultural resources, archaeological resources, grave sites, ancestors that are there and need to be protected. And as we continue to see sea level rise, there may be issues and instances where we also need to think about, how do we protect burial sites? How do we protect cultural resources, from museums to sacred sites, to enable their ability to be present or accessible for future generations. And I think there's a lot of really cool ways to do that. Right now, University of Rhode Island over the past 10 years has done some really innovative work on underwater archaeology, partnering with the Narragansett tribe. I also think there's future work that we can do in terms of utilizing technology and virtual reality simulations to archive some of our sacred sites, some of our spaces where they may be underwater in future years, and be able to have them exist in a digital space. And there are some communities that are already working on that. The next principle is unite, which is unite with other communities to build capacity and plan relocation. And I think this is also a really great principle for understanding not only how we unite as tribal nations in the region to scale up our resources, because in many instances, although we are mighty, we may be small in either existing land holdings or in population or in experience of dealing with federal agencies and or the federal government at large. And so it helps to be able to come together to scale up resources, to learn from one another, from our successes, from our challenges. And I think that that is also true of how we can partner and engage with our non-Indigenous neighbors. And so, there are great things that a local municipality, even, in our work with Shinnecock, we partner with the town of Southampton often on certain projects to try and think through our shared resiliency. And I hope that more of that happens in the future. The last principle is move, which is move to new places with cultural connections and rebuild. And so this is the most challenging one. I think it's also probably the principle that is the principle of last resort, right? When we think about climate change, when we think about climate migration, managed retreat, we have to do so in a way that enables human dignity. And I think also enables human dignity for communities that have been historically, contemporarily, systemically oppressed and face gross injustice, like Indigenous communities. And we also have to reconcile with the ways in which our existing legislation, law, and policy doesn't allow for people to relocate with dignity. And that is particularly true for Indigenous nations in the Northeast and other parts of the United States and the world. We should be able to relocate to territory that we have a cultural connection to. Don't relocate us to the middle of upstate New York in our relatives in the Haudenosaunee territory where we have no ability to access the sea. Because that's not culturally connected to us and to how we've existed in this part of the world for millennia. So there's a lot to be done. I am hopeful that the new administration, through different pieces of legislation, whether it be through the new infrastructure bill or ocean-based climate solutions, allocate resources for climate relocation and migration with dignity, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for all communities who have been disenfranchised and faced gross disproportionate burdens of injustice historically. There should be no reason why an American citizen cannot relocate or have dignity in the face of the climate crisis. So as I leave you and we transition into our question and answer session, some high-level summary of what I've shared with you today. Sea level rise presents increased risks to our coastal communities, and it does present also vast implications for our regional security, particularly in the context of water security. Globally, sea level rise adaptation frameworks fail to include Indigenous peoples and knowledge in the development of adaptation strategies. I have presented you one adaptation framework within one region of a small portion of what is now known as the United States. And globally, we have so many Indigenous peoples. And largely, studies have found that Indigenous peoples protect about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So when we think about what is one of the best nature-based solutions to climate change, it is to protect our biodiversity. So we need to be leaning into Indigenous knowledge for adaptation, because within that Indigenous knowledge is a form and a method that has been proven over millennia for the protection of biodiversity and for the protection of blue carbon ecosystems. And lastly, we need more localized and context-specific adaptation strategies like the wampum framework. Again, the wampum framework was specific to our region, to our tribal communities, to our sister tribes within New England, as we have related to one another for time immemorial. But it's not going to work on the west coast of California or Washington State. There may be some shared principles, but we need more localized adaptation frameworks. Even within settler communities, I could see very well there being a Black adaptation framework for the city of Miami. There really should be ways in which we are responsive to the unique cultural representations across our communities, and that we make sure that no one is left behind. So with that, I hope that we all are able to, like the oceans, rise and learn to live with water, not fight it. Tabutni, thank you, and we'll turn it over for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey. Always fantastic to hear you talk on so many levels. While I'm reading through the questions that are coming in here, maybe you could speak a little bit more to this Supreme Court case that is making it more difficult for tribal nations to acquire new land.
Yes, definitely. So it's called the Carcieri case, and we're hoping that there's a Carcieri fix, which is sometimes you might hear that in legislation or through the Secretary of the Interior. Now Deb Haaland talking about the need to fix this decision or fix this legislative issue. Within that case, the court decided, it was a case that was brought forward in the context of our region and the Narragansett tribe. The case was decided that if you are a tribe that received recognition, federal recognition, after 1934, which was the Indian Reorganization Act period, that you couldn't take new land into trust. There are different land tenure statuses for tribal nations throughout the United States. Many of our tribal nations along the East Coast we have a wide variety of land tenure statuses, many of them being Aboriginal lands or fee simple lands, lands that were never sold, unceded lands. And so it's very complex, it's a little complicated. That was a bit of my trying to footnote law 101. But what we see is that without a carciary fix, without a fix to that decision, many tribal nations in the East Coast who have longstanding treaty and government to government, nation to nation relationships that predate the United States, because the United States formed about 200 years after we, are already in formative relationships of nation to nation relationships with the Commonwealth of Virginia, the colony of New York, Massachusetts, etc. There is a very fragmented approach to Indigenous land tenure for tribes in the East, which makes it very difficult to take in new land because of this case. And yeah, it's very difficult. I hope that was a good answer, but if the individual that asked that question has more, I can do a deeper dive.
Great, thanks. So we have another question asking if you could say more about what has been the effect on various audiences of changing the language and framing from militant and combative to collaborative and healing.
Oh, really good question. I was just looking at it because I needed a visual representation of that. I think a lot of folks now, when I call it out, they're like, wow, yeah, that is so true. They just, it didn't resonate, or they didn't recognize it at first until someone started calling it out. So I hope that changes. A little bit of the background to that is some of the folks that put forward those adaptation principles are like the Army Corps of Engineers, quote, Army. So like they I don't want to totally rag on the Army Corps of Engineers. Some of you may be from there, and I'm sure you're wonderful people. But you have a legacy to also reconcile with, and you're coming from that military background. So there's logic to how this terminology got put into place, but we also have to challenge it. We have to think about the language, the narrative, the communication tools that we use, and how they may or may not resonate with communities, particularly communities that have been systemically oppressed. When we think about even Indigenous communities, communities of color, the Black community, when we don't want to be, we're already met with violence in our daily lives. We went through the past 2 years of a social justice reckoning. We just, we're about a month out from George Floyd's anniversary. And when we think about all of that, it's hard to enable adaptation to climate change when you constantly are pushing forward narratives of violence, when you already have communities that have to deal with that on a daily basis. So we have to think about what are the narratives of healing, hope, resiliency that we can put forward. And there's a whole swath of literature in the context of climate adaptation as well that says for us to start focusing less on vulnerabilities and more on resiliency and the ways in which we're already doing really wonderful work in this space of climate action. So I hope that answered your question. The only other thing I will say too is sometimes we use very gendered language in our approach to climate action and climate adaptation. So it's not just the militarized effect, but it's also the way in which we prioritize, in large part, a male orientation to our communication tools.
Great. So this question falls in line with Indigenous-based solutions, and sort of that, the perspective or nature-based is another way of it has been packaged, as you mentioned. So this is a question about how public settler education systems could work to enlighten local and state governments about Indigenous place-based and ancestral knowledge regarding climate and water justice.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so how can the public settler educational system work to enlighten local and state governments about Indigenous place-based and ancestral knowledges regarding climate and water justice?
Really good question. So I feel like there's two systems there. There's the education system, and then there's the local government system, and how they come into interaction. That's challenging because I don't know if they even do that in the context of other areas of work. I think maybe if we think about public education as universities, community colleges, I feel like when you're starting to train people to go into careers that may be populated within local government, state government, et cetera, we could be doing more to enable Indigenous science and knowledge being taught alongside other scientific traditions and scientific disciplines. And I think that would help to move us in the right direction, for there to be more knowledge of this work, more access to these types of knowledge systems, and then to think creatively about how to enable knowledge co-mobilization across different scientific traditions, not just Indigenous and not just settler, but also those from other parts of the world as well. So I would say that. And then lastly, authenticity is important. So there are people from the region who can speak to these knowledge systems, who can speak to best practices, and that is tribes themselves and Indigenous leaders themselves. And so partnering directly with them to enable these knowledge dissemination activities, I think, is your best foot forward.
Great. So there are two questions that are kind of on the same theme now, talking about sort of borders. There's thanks to you and mention of it being a wonderful presentation. And then do you have any thoughts about how we as an Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can impact the NOAA and state coastal zones visions to include these kind of discussions to change the way coastal lands are managed, and sort of from a cross-border perspective is sort of another theme that the questions are coming in about.
Okay. Gosh, these are really great questions. I'm sorry, John, I think you combined two, but can you tell me it one more time?
Okay, I'll just do the first one.
Okay.
Do you have thoughts about how we as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can impact the NOAA and state coastal zones to include these kinds of discussions to change the way coastal lands are managed?
Yes. Okay, so that's a question I will first tackle. That one, we need a legislative fix. So vote, advocate within your constituency and with your congressional representative to change the Coastal Zone Management Act, because right now tribes are not mentioned. There was some talk of amending that act within the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which was kind of a BMF bill. I don't believe it's moved much more forward in Congress right now. I think it's being sort of sliced off into pieces. But without a fix to that legislative act, it's going to be very difficult to change the way in which management occurs, because unfortunately, states and municipalities still will default to being delegated more authority and will not treat tribes on an equal playing field.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. And so this is, could you talk a little more about the process for creating the wampum framework? While we need local context, I'm looking for some wisdom and best practices that tribes could use to start this process.
Yes, so a lot of the wampum framework came from listening sessions that we have done through the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean in terms of framing the idea behind why this is needed. And so I think being able to engage with tribal nations, with Indigenous leaders in whatever region you're working in directly, and have open, gatherings, conversations about these topics will provide us, a stepping stone to develop these frameworks. So I am really much an advocate for community-based participatory research. It's also very much a theoretical framework based on those conversations, about 10 years of work on, regional ocean planning bodies and existing projects that tribes were already doing, and sort of synthesizing all of those into, a replicable framework. Our hope in the future is that we'll actually be able to pilot the framework with additional tribal nations in the region to see, of the principles listed, what might be some additional projects that they would want to work on to operationalize any or all of the principles. So I hope that answers your question. It's kind of definitely go to the source, which is the tribes themselves, set up listening sessions, workshops, opportunities for community-based learning for knowledge co-mobilization around adaptation efforts. And then from there, I think it's also planning out projects from inception with communities to tackle the climate action areas that they feel are most important.
Great. Unfortunately, there's a lot of questions that are coming in, but we just don't have time to handle all of them as usual. We have over 200 people that are logged in here. And if we were really rounding this up in person, you'd get this huge round of applause, I imagine, but maybe people can sort of send those thanks via the chat. We're so thankful for Dr. Leonard joining us and making such a fabulous presentation. We're going to have a short break, and then I really hope that people can join us for the panel discussion at 10:45 on climate adaptation justice. So we hope to see you back here in 15 minutes or so. And thank you again, Dr. Leonard, for taking the time to give this presentation.
Well, Tabuni, thank you all for the invitation, and thanks to everyone who signed on for today. It was a really great conversation and great questions. So thanks so much.